Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means. My name is Jared Thomason. I'm your host. Today is my birthday. If you're listening to this the day that it comes out, that means for free or on Patreon. If you're listening to it after that, I'm somewhere past 43. Who knows? But I decided to release this episode, my conversation with Ryan Stokes, on my 43rd birthday, because I was so eager to get him on the podcast for the entirety of the time that the podcast has been out. He was one of the first guests that I wanted, and I finally got it to work out. Super thrilled to be able to talk about this fabulously interesting book. It is helpful to those who were raised in the church and taught a certain very, I think, crystallized theology, something that had been quite well formed over the centuries. Or if you're not, if you're not someone who has that background, I think you would still benefit not only from this conversation, but even more so from reading his book and learning about the development of the figure of the Satan as a superhuman character in the divine narrative within the biblical text, within biblical texts. So, yeah, there's not going to be a tag at the end. This episode is going to go out to every platform that I can, for audio and for video. And yeah, happy birthday to me. It's a gift that I want to give for my birthday to all of you. I will say, I want to reiterate, because it is my birthday month, the first 5 people within the month of April 2026 to join as a $5 supporter, $5 a month supporter at patreon.com/itmeanswhatitmeanspodcast. The first 5 of you will receive a copy of a book by Kurt Vonnegut. If you're watching the video, Kurt sits every episode over my right shoulder between my commemorative Lord of the Rings glasses. He was a very important author for me back when I was 19 years old and I first started reading him. And he died on my birthday. So I will say not only happy birthday to me, but rest in peace to Kurt Vonnegut Jr., or as he would say, so it goes. With that said, enjoy my conversation with Ryan Stokes. Ryan Stokes, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jared. Excited to be here.
And I'm eager to get into your book, The Satan, How God's Executioner Became the Enemy. But before we do that, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, happy to do it. Let's see here. I suppose the first thing that I need to share about myself is that I am a person of faith. I'm a Christian, grew up in a Christian home, and that's a big part of my story and my journey. And when I was in college, I sensed that maybe God wanted me to enter ministry. But the more I kind of pursued that calling or considered that calling, the more I realized it was an academic ministry. I took a class on Bible in college on the life and teachings of the Apostle Paul and just loved it and thought, if I can get a job where I get paid to study and teach the Bible for the rest of my professional life, then that's what I want to do. And so that's what I pursued. I entered seminary and from there did a PhD. And that's who I am. I have a wife named Robin. We've been married 23 years, and I have 2 sons. I was about to say 2 teenage sons, but one of them is 20 years old now. But I have a son who's in college and one who's about to graduate from high school, Seth and Sam.
Yeah, my baby turns 19 in days. Like, we are days away from that. So that it really does kind of hit you, because mine's almost not a teenager anymore. So in the process of becoming an academic, obviously you landed on doing research that brought you to write this book. Is that safe to assume, or how did you end up writing this book?
Absolutely. Yeah, this was not a hobby. This was professional.
So what was the course that brought you to this topic of research?
Uh, sure. So while I was working on my PhD, and I'm not sure how many of your listeners are familiar with the way the PhD process works. PhD is a research doctorate, and so part of what you're doing is learning how to do original research as a PhD student, and your culminating project that you have to complete in order to earn your PhD is what's called a dissertation. And a dissertation is essentially a very academic book that you write. You come up with an original line of inquiry and original conclusions, hopefully, and you spend 2 or 3 years just writing a book. And the way this worked for me, Jared, is I wanted to write. I was studying especially the early Jewish context of the New Testament or early Jewish literature. Roughly speaking, this is the literature between the Old and New Testament, but there's a lot of overlap there chronologically. And I was especially interested within early Jewish literature in this story about fallen angels that we have a little bit of a hint of in Genesis 6, where you have sons of God who have children with human women. And the way the story is picked up in early Jewish texts. And this story became really important and was part of the conversation in early Judaism about the origin of evil or the problem of sin. And so I wanted to write about how this story related to the Jewish discussions of sin and evil. And I got into the project and wrote a couple of chapters, but the more I got into this project, the more I realized that in early Judaism, the real debate, the most heated debate about the problem of evil and the problem of sin centered not on these fallen angels specifically, but on Satan and evil spirits. And so in that process of research, my project morphed into a book on primarily Satan, but also to some extent on demons and evil spirits, and then to a lesser extent on fallen angels in general.
I kind of want to get terminology under, like, get a concept of terminology. So the name Satan, like, one, in this conversation, should I be thinking of Satan as a character, a figure? What? And then could you kind of go through some of the Hebrew and Greek terminology that readers of a translation may not be or may not know they're encountering because it's been rendered into English?
Great. Yeah, and this is exactly the right question to ask, because where we begin our investigation will in large part determine where it ends up. And so if we begin with certain theological presuppositions about this figure, then that's going to determine largely where we end up going with the conversation. But I think, as you've asked, Jared, the right place to begin is just with terminology. What does the word Satan even mean? And so in my book, I talk about the Hebrew word Satan and what that word means. And most studies of Satan will have some sort of discussion about what the word Satan means. One of the things, or one of the conclusions that I come to that distinguishes my work from the work of others, is that I do not think that the word Satan means adversary or accuser. If you pick up any old book on Satan or article on Satan, it will probably say something like Satan means adversary or accuser. And as I looked in the Old Testament to see where this word occurs, and it occurs in all kinds of contexts. It occurs with reference to heavenly beings. The word Satan occurs with reference to humans. A human could be called a Satan. And in my research, Satan just means something like attacker, like someone who physically attacks or harms someone else, or more specifically, an executioner. If a person is killing someone on behalf of an authority, on behalf of King David or on behalf of God, and this person that's being killed is a criminal or a sinner, then this Satan is an executioner. And so in the Old Testament, you have the word Satan, which means attacker, executioner. The word diabolos or devil is just kind of a translation of Satan. It's not quite as specific as Satan, but it refers to opponents more generally. One question that I'm commonly asked is the devil and Satan, are they the same people? And yes, that does seem to be the case where both of these terms are used. They do seem to be interchangeable. Satan or Satan is Hebrew, and devil or diabolos is just the Greek translation of that. So you get more devil in the New Testament and more Satan in the Old Testament, so to speak. Why don't I take a breath there, Jared, and let you follow up? I don't want to ramble on and if I'm
No,
not going in
well,
the
hold
direction
on.
you
I
want me to
told
go.
you about that. You ramble all you like. I do want to clarify. Would Diabolos be what appears in a Septuagint text?
Yes. Interestingly, in some texts in the Septuagint, you get diabolos, and in some texts, you get just the word Satan spelled with Greek letters, which is also what we find in the New Testament. You get diabolos in some New Testament texts, but in some texts, they spell Satan with Greek letters.
So Diabolos would be a translation, and then they would just transliterate it into Greek characters. They would be sounded out.
That's right. That's right. So in some cases, they'll transliterate it. In some cases, they'll translate it into diabolos.
Okay, and I want. I mean, I do have more questions in that, but I understand like this project is not a text critical one primarily. Okay, so the terminology kind of being laid down, there is a theology that seems to be being read back into Hebrew texts that does seem pretty fully formed in Greek New Testament text or in apocryphal or pseudepigraphal text. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose it depends on what you mean by fully formed, but certainly it's much more developed in the later texts after the time of the Old Testament and in the New Testament than it is in the Old Testament. If by fully formed you mean what we have in Milton Paradise Lost, it's not quite there yet in the New Testament, but certainly it's more fully formed in the New Testament.
I'm thinking particularly of, I don't know, in the Gospels where Jesus is this comes to memory because I saw someone referencing that this is the gospel reading for this coming Sunday, that or maybe it was this past Sunday, of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. Satan is there, or Paul saying like, hand this man who's been living with his father's wife, hand him over to Satan. So that is a more complex theological framework than what we tend to see in a lot of Hebrew texts, right?
Absolutely. It's thinking about Satan. And just to clarify, my study is more a history of beliefs about Satan than it is like constructing my own theology of Satan or telling you exactly what you should believe about Satan with putting the whole Bible together. This is a history of beliefs about Satan. And so I start in the earliest texts and say, well, what does the book of Zechariah seem to assume about Satan? And what does Zechariah say about Satan? Then what does Job say about Satan, which is a little later, I think. And then what do some of the Dead Sea Scrolls say about Satan? And then the New Testament. And you certainly see a development in thinking about Satan over time. And the later literature, for the most part, is far more developed than the earlier literature.
So on that, I'm glad you mentioned Job, because the Job material. So I remember reading your book, and I mentioned him before we started recording, but talking to my friend Daniel and being like, there's this idea that like the Satan portions of the narrative are a later addition. Well, talking to another friend of mine, and she was like, what? And then talking to Daniel, and he's like, oh yeah, you didn't know that? I'm like, yeah, of course I didn't know that. People don't talk about that. That's a pretty, like, I don't know, that's an academic kind of thing. But do you mind explaining what I'm just kind of glossing over there? And is this a controversial, even within academia, point of view?
That's right. Yeah, it certainly is controversial. And Jared, you're not alone if you didn't know this. I didn't even know this until I was doing my study. As I was doing my study, I got to the part of my research where I was writing on Job, and I was looking at these texts really closely, and it suddenly dawned on me that made sense of this story. And I wish I could remember the exact verses. I don't have the information right in front of me, but but in Job, just to summarize the story as a whole, you have this person named Job who's very wealthy, one of the wealthiest people in the world. He's also the most righteous person in the world, which is that's fair. That's a good thing. And you learn this, you're introduced to Job, and then you have a scene in heaven where the sons of God are presenting themselves before God, and Satan is there among them, apparently because he's one of them. And God says to Satan, "Hey, have you noticed how great Job is?" And Satan's like, "Yeah." But he's only doing this because of how much you bless him. And if you really want to know whether Job's faithful to you or not, then you need to stop blessing him and actually send some hardship his way. And then you'll see whether he's really faithful to you in a disinterested fashion rather than simply in return for what you do for him. And so that's what happens. And you have Job, he loses everything that we learned that he had all his wealth, his animals, and of all different sorts, and his slaves, which was a part of wealth at this time. He loses all those things in a single day, and his children as well. Because that was part of God's blessing to him as well. And so he loses all these things, but Job remains faithful to God. Then we have another scene in heaven where God says again, hey, I did what you said. I inflicted suffering on Job for no reason at all, just to test him here. And he's still faithful. And Satan says, well, yes, but if you inflict more suffering, then you'll see that he's really not going to be faithful to you. And at this point, Job he becomes very, very sick, but he remains faithful to God. That's the story of Job, at least the first couple of chapters of Job. As I was doing my research, what I realized is that these scenes in heaven in which Satan and God have these conversations, as well as that second whole ordeal that Job goes through where he gets sick, those seem to be added by whether you call him the author of the book or an editor of the book. But in short, Job seems to have been written in stages, and the scenes involving Satan are from a later stage of the story rather than an earlier stage. In the earlier stage of the story, it just says Job is this wealthy, righteous person. Then he loses everything that he has, but he remains faithful to God. In a later version of Job, you get Satan who's causing these problems for Job. And in addition to Job losing everything he has, he also gets sick. He's afflicted very directly, physically himself.
And so that fitting that within the development of a theology. I mean, and I understand there are probably going to be people listening. I'm sure you've encountered these folks who are just like, that's not true. And largely, whether they say it or not, because that's not what I believe. However, there is ample evidence that ancient texts were not constructed or authored or developed in the same way that modern texts are, where maybe a single author or a team in a very short period of time sit down, produce a thing, and there's a finalized version that's then published. And now it's unquestionable what the text itself is. These things are transmitted over a long time, so a lot of the production may be incorporated into the transmission. Does that am I off base on that?
No, that's very well put, Jared. One of the things I tell people who ask me about this is that another story involving a Satan in the Old Testament is 1 Chronicles 21, which is a story of David taking a census of Israel, and this census is rebellious against God in some way that's not clearly explained in the text, but it's wrong for David to do this, and God sends an angel that kills thousands of Israelites as a result. But we have this story both in 2 Samuel 24 and in 1 Chronicles 21. And in 2 Samuel 24, it says that God was angry with Israel, and so he incited David to take this census, which is theologically really interesting. But what I'm getting at is that this version of the same story in 1 Chronicles, the same incident, the census, doesn't say that God is angry with Israel and he incited David to take the census, but says that a Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census. And so even elsewhere in the Bible, we have an example of a version of a story in which something kind of theologically interesting happens, maybe some suffering, some sin involved, and then a later version of the story in which an editor said, you know what, it makes a whole lot of sense if there's a Satan figure who's involved in this. And he explains that earlier story by explaining that a Satan figure was involved. And that's what we have in 1 Chronicles 21. So what we have in Job is not a whole lot different from that, where there was an earlier story that didn't involve a Satan, at least at the literary level. Say what you want about the historical events, but at the literary level, there wasn't a Satan involved, and a later interpreter, editor, author of the story said, you know what, I think it would clarify this story a bit if we explain that there's a Satan figure who was involved here. And so that's the version of the story that we have in our Bibles. We don't have the earlier story of Job in our Bibles, just the later story. Now, if someone is curious about this, my book, I deal with this. I talk about my arguments for understanding Job this way in, I think it's chapter 2 of my book. And feel free to take a look at it and make up your mind for yourself. I tell my students, they certainly don't have to agree with me. But if someone's interested in seeing what my arguments are, they're laid out there in the second chapter of the book.
I mean, for sure, get the book. And yeah, it is chapter 2. And I was rereading that, I don't know, last week or the week before, maybe, while I was getting my oil changed. And I was like, oh, this is better than I thought. You know what? I feel like in the 3 years I've been doing this podcast, and in the maybe 5 years since I read this book initially, like, I've learned to read better because, or I've become better at reading, because I'd read some of the notes that I put in there initially, and I would be like, just stop making notes and like read and see what he says. I think kind of part and parcel with the development of Satan as a figure or character, as an embodiment of evil, maybe, is a development of the divine as more transcendent than maybe what you have in some of the older texts. And that is difficult. And I'll refer the audience to the conversations I've had with people, Ellen DeDonker, Jenny Grillo, on embodiment, and Gad Barnea on kind of the development of monotheism, that our concepts do not necessarily just pick up and transfer into the ancient world, particularly the ancient Near East. So is there a challenge in kind of like grabbing the thorny issue of the development of Satan that involves the development of the divine identity?
It sure does, and this is something that I could probably deal with more extensively than I have. But it sure does. In general, this is not original to me, but in general, as we see literature moving along chronologically, reading literature from earlier literature to later literature, we can see that God, it becomes clearer and clearer that God's different from us, and God seems to make use of intermediaries to go between him and us to a greater extent in later literature than he does in earlier literature. Now, this isn't 100% true. I mean, you have angels and other figures like this serving God, even in the early text of the Old Testament. But you do see a little bit more of this as you move along. And you certainly see more of this in Chronicles, for instance, than you do in Samuel and so forth. And so this idea of Satan and his role and the development of this figure fits into that overall conversation to some extent. But then you add to that, or throw into the mix, the fact that the things that the Satan figure seems to do, or the Satan seems to do, have to do with evil things. And I think that early Jewish interpreters were especially eager to distance God from some of those sorts of activities. And it was convenient for them theologically to have Satan harming Israel rather than God harming Israel, or Satan leading people to sin. If Satan's doing that, that makes it especially clear that God's not doing it. And so, in addition to God using angels as intermediaries more frequently in the later literature, add to that the fact that early interpreters would have been especially keen on distancing God from some of the less pleasant aspects of God's work. And so Satan and evil spirits, demons, they would fit nicely and be really helpful theologically for people who are trying to talk about who God is and how God relates to us.
So, like I told you before we started recording, I may slot this episode earlier than it actually falls in when it's being recorded. And if that happens, the interviews I'm about to reference, the audience will not have heard or seen them yet. But I'm thinking, so Leslie Bain's book on C.S. Lewis, she talks about kind of his engagement with Judaism, or his understanding of Judaism, where he's like, Jews see themselves as unjustly suffering in the world, and Christians see themselves as worthy of suffering, and that their theology, and I'm not asking you to endorse or co-sign that, but that had a lot to do with his engagement with biblical text. And then the other one is Daniel Glover's Jesus and Other Sons of God, and he spends the conclusion engaging with his friend and mine, Colin Cornell, on like, how do we understand revelation and the development of biblical texts and our understanding of the divine, and trying to incorporate what seem to be missteps. And so I think, I mean, look, there are Psalms where the psalmist is angry at God and the divine is being called out for the suffering that people, I think so what I'm saying is there are biblical texts that are saying God is responsible for this injustice. And there are biblical texts and narratives and theology that attempt to like cordon the divine off from that. And it certainly makes sense with regard to the development of a Satan, or like an ultimate evil in the universe. There's no question there. I'm sorry that I wanted to get all of those thoughts out there and see, does that like resonate with your research and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you put it very well. I'm glad that you said that because you're absolutely right. There are texts that are unashamed to say that God is the one who has done this. And Job's a great example of this. Job says, God has done this to me. And even when you have Satan who's afflicting Job in the book of Job, what Satan says to God is, stretch forth your hand and strike him. So even when Satan does something to Job in the book of Job, Satan is doing so as an agent of God. And so God is ultimately responsible for that, even in Job, which does lead me to another thing that I have not said yet, Jared, but probably we should throw out there. In the earlier texts, especially, but to some extent in the later texts, Satan is not really presented as God's enemy, but as someone who works for God. He's God's executioner, executing sinners on God's behalf and doing things that God wants him to do. And so when he causes trouble for Job, he's doing so under God's authority. And in Zechariah 3, I believe he's there to execute the high priest Joshua, because the high priest Joshua has come before God iniquitously. He's wearing these filthy clothes. He's bearing his iniquity in God's presence, which in Exodus we learn is if you come before God wearing the wrong thing, if you're a priest, you can die. And Satan is there to kill him. And that's what the Satan or Satan is supposed to do. And he's not in rebellion against God, but serving God. So all that to say is when we talk about God's relationship to human suffering, there would have been a spectrum of possible explanations. And we see nearly the entire spectrum in the Bible, where we see some passages that say, hey, this suffering is from God. And that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be because the humans deserve the suffering, or it could be despite the fact that the humans didn't deserve the suffering, but it's from God either way. On the other hand, you have, well, the suffering is, maybe God has allowed it, but this is because someone has sinned and is rebellion against God, whether that be some heavenly being or some human being, and that's where the suffering is from. And then you have a range of options between those two ends of the spectrum, in which God perhaps is causing the suffering through an intermediary, or is sending the suffering this person's way because he's helping this person to grow. It has some sort of positive purpose. And so you have a whole range of options with regard to suffering in the Bible, and all the way from God being in charge to it being someone who's in rebellion against God who's causing it.
So, pivoting, because I have the table of contents up in front of me because I was checking, is the Job thing, chapter 2. And there's another, I guess, character or figure that comes up in your book, and it reminded me of, and this is a weird metaphor, but anyone who knows me or is engaged with this podcast will not be surprised. Watching the Three Stooges as a kid, and it's Larry, Moe, and Curly, and then you find out like there were other guys, and so that other guy in this case is the Prince of Mastema. Like, hold on, it's not just like Satan and that develops. So who is the Prince of Mastema?
Yeah. It's also, one question is this another guy, or is this just another name for Satan? And that's one of the things I have to deal with in my book is we have figures. We've already mentioned Satan and the devil, but we also have Belial, and we have the Prince of Mastema, or the Angel of Darkness, and we have these other figures. And so are these different characters that these books are talking about, or are these just different names for Satan? And that's a question you almost have to ask on a book by book basis, because one book he may call Satan the Prince of Mastema, another book may distinguish Satan and the Prince of Mastema. So you almost have to ask this on a book by book basis. But the main place, the primary work in which the Prince of Mastema occurs, is the Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BC Jewish work. Mastema, by the way, means something like enmity or hostility, and this is a figure in the Book of Jubilees. He's going around trying to cause trouble for Israel, leading the nations into sin, and then sending his evil spirits to punish them when they do sin. And so it's an appropriate name for this figure. I do think in Jubilees that the Prince of Mastema is the same person as Satan, for a couple of reasons. One is in chapter 10, I believe it is, in Jubilees, he seems to be referred to as Satan. But the main reason is in another text in Jubilees. It's the passage in Jubilees. So the Book of Jubilees is a Jewish retelling, expansion on the biblical books of Genesis and roughly the first half of Exodus. So from creation all the way to Mount Sinai. And in the part of this story where he gets to the near sacrifice of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, as it's called in Jewish tradition, or the sacrifice of Isaac, as it's called in Christian tradition. The book of Jubilees has rewritten this story so that it sounds a whole lot like Job. You have a scene in heaven where God is talking about how great Abraham is, not Job in this case, but Abraham. And you have the Prince of Mastema who comes to God and says, well, is Abraham really that great? If you want to know whether Abraham's truly faithful to you, then tell him to sacrifice his son Isaac, and that way you'll find out whether he's faithful to you or not. And so this story's been rewritten so that the Prince of Mastema is doing to Abraham the same thing that Satan did to Job, which leads me to conclude that the Prince of Mastema in Jubilees is just another name for Satan. Now, what's interesting, though, when you get different names for Satan, it's not just that it's half of one, six a dozen of the other. These different names, even though they refer to the same person, they do have significant theological import. And so when we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls and Satan there is called Belial, and Belial is a word that has connotations of wickedness. And the reason that name would have been so appropriate for Satan in the Dead Sea Scrolls is because in the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the time you get there, thinking on Satan has evolved to the point where Satan is not just someone punishing sinners on behalf of God, but his primary role is leading people into sin. And so he has a name in the Dead Sea Scrolls that reflects this new theological emphasis, a name that reflects that Satan is out there causing people to sin against God.
I'm glad you brought that up because I know I put it in my questions, and that's something that I'm wondering, because as I'm getting older and I'm learning, I'll particularly reference the Jesus and the Jewish Law podcast and the work that Logan and Paul have done on that. But it brought up this understanding that I did not have when I was a teenager engaging with biblical text, that a lot of like the unclean language, like there's ritual purity language that I think has been conflated with like moral sinfulness, that kind of thing. So has the development of Satan theologically coincided with a broadening of the understanding of evil and an application within biblical texts of like this thing is a representation of evil that maybe wasn't intended in the original authorship?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe it would be helpful for me to address that question by just kind of summarizing briefly, if I can, how I understand the development of Satan from its earliest references to that figure or similar figure in the Old Testament through the New Testament. And just really, and I'll do it really briefly. Initially,
No rush.
Well, I don't want to talk for hours and hours and hours about it, but in the earliest texts that mention heavenly Satans in the Old Testament, Satan seems to be someone who is an executioner on God's behalf, someone who punishes sinners on God's behalf, causes trouble for the wicked. But somewhere along the way, people begin to ask, okay, we understand that God punishes the wicked, that bad things happen to bad people. That's good. What about those times when bad things happen to good people? And so that's the question that's being asked, or one of the questions that's being. Job is actually a really complex book, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but one of the questions that's being asked in the book of Job is, why do bad things happen to good people? Do bad things happen to good people? And if so, why? And the answer that we get from the book of Job as we now have it is, well, there's this figure named Satan who he punishes evil people, but apparently, at least on occasion, he can cause trouble for evil people. And so that explanation seems to have persuaded a number of people and became very popular. And so we see Satan moving forward in literature, right? All the way through early Jewish or New Testament. And he's not just causing trouble for bad people, but he's causing trouble for good people. A little bit later on, someone said, well, okay, we see why Satan punishes sinners and why Satan causes trouble even for people who don't sin sometimes. But why do people sin to begin with? And so that's where the book of Jubilees comes in. Or actually, before the book of Jubilees, there's a book called the Book of the Watchers, a 3rd century BCE book that says that people committed idolatry because there are these evil spirits in the world leading them to commit idolatry. They're not just choosing to do this themselves, that there's these spirits who do this. And then the book of Jubilees picks that up and says, yes, they're doing this, and they work for Satan. Satan's involved in this too. So now we have Satan not just punishing, causing suffering for the evil people, or not just causing suffering for good people, but now he's also leading idolaters to sin. He's leading the nations into sin. A little bit later, so that's around the 2nd century BC. A little bit later than that, we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe later in the 2nd century, early 1st century BCE, the Dead Sea Scrolls say, well, okay, we know why evil people sin. We know why the Gentiles sin, or we know why they sin, but why do some Jews sin? Like we Jews in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was a sect where they thought that they understood the law and that the rest of their fellow Jews misunderstood the law. And they say, well, why? We know why the Gentiles sin. Well, why do those other Jews sin? And they say, well, that's Belial, or that's Satan leading them to sin. Then eventually, in another Dead Sea Scroll, they say, well, why do even the good guys sin? Even people who are part of our community, even we sin sometimes. Why is that? And there's a text known as the Treatise on the Two Spirits. And it says, well, it's because there's a spirit of darkness that's out there. And there's an angel of darkness that I think is probably to be identified with Belial or Satan. But he's leading, even the good guys get led to sin by Satan sometimes. And so that's what we have in the New Testament, where you have Satan who's doing all of these things. He's punishing sinners in the New Testament. He's causing trouble for good people. He's leading non-believers to sin. And he's even leading Christians, trying to lead Christians to sin. I mean, of all people, Satan comes and tries to get Jesus to sin in Mark and Matthew 4 and Luke 4. I think you mentioned the temptation narrative earlier. But yeah, if Satan wants everyone to sin, apparently, by the time we get to the New Testament, even Jesus, if he can make that happen.
So the book of the Watchers, and you mentioned Qumran, so that was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Like, that was something lost until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 50s. Or it might have been one of the later caches, right? Like, that wasn't, Book of the Watchers wasn't something that people just had access to for centuries, right?
Well, most of us didn't have access to it. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was originally written in Aramaic, and we found, when I say we, I mean scholars. I didn't find the scrolls.
It wasn't you and I.
That's right. But scholars were archaeologists and actually Bedouin shepherds were the ones who discovered most of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they found copies of the Book of the Watchers in the original Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Prior to that, the book was available in Ethiopic, as a classical Ethiopian language. And it was actually one of the scriptures of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And there were also a couple of copies or a small number of manuscripts of a Greek translation of the Book of Watchers. But no one really paid attention to it until, 100 or so.
Yeah, I know. And I checked the index because I didn't remember seeing any of these. I wasn't looking for it, but I talked to James Vanderkam about R.H. Charles yesterday. Mm-hmm. And R.H. Charles did a lot of work on both Jubilees and I believe the book of, Enoch for sure. But a lot of these texts that are Ethiopic were, like they were being translated, and then they found a Greek text later on, and that was, he was working about 100 years ago. That's just trivia.
That's right. See, R.H. Charles was into this literature before it was cool.
Yeah.
And so we're grateful for his work. And so that's why I said no one, when I say no one, I mean, outside of Ethiopia, no one was really into this literature until about 120 years ago, when R.H. Charles, among a few others, really brought our attention to it.
Yeah, he was a busy guy way back when. Man, okay. You have answered a lot. You're one of those who you give me a lot of the answers before I even ask the question. So you kind of keep me on my toes. So, and I'll use the SBL Study Bible as an example, because I know I don't own many Bibles that have the Apocrypha because I grew up evangelical. They're just not out there. But how would you advise those out there in the audience who are just sitting down with an English translation of a Bible to engage with biblical texts? Because when you talk about oldest biblical texts, that does not mean like, oh, it's Genesis at the beginning of your Bible. How would you encourage them to read, to kind of track for themselves the development that you're charting in your book, aside from reading your book and following along?
Right. So are you asking about how to read the Bible in general, being conscious of the chronological development, or are you asking more specifically about Satan, how to study this for themselves?
I think with regard to the Satan material, if someone is curious, like, how can I see this for myself? Do my own research, as it were.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the challenges of doing this research is that most people are reading the Bible through a translation and not in the original Greek and Hebrew. And so when it comes to Satan, the word Satan occurs several times in the Old Testament, but it's not always translated Satan. Uh, another challenge is sometimes when it is translated Satan, it's even then it's not translated correctly because it's not a name Satan, but it's the title the Satan or the executioner or the attacker, something like that. So one of the challenges for reading the Bible chronologically is, if you're wanting to study Satan that way, is identifying exactly what passages Satan or a Satan figure occurs in the English translation. Why don't I do this? Why don't I give you kind of a chronological run through of the biblical text? If you want to read this for yourself chronologically, here's the order in which I would do it. My guess is that the earliest text that talks about a Satan figure is Numbers 22. And this is one of those passages where the Hebrew word Satan occurs twice, but in neither time is it translated Satan. But in Numbers 22, you have the sorcerer Balaam. I was just talking about this in church the other day. But the sorcerer Balaam is going to curse Israel, and the angel of the Lord stands in front of him, and Balaam cannot see the angel of the Lord with a sword, but the donkey can, and the donkey stops, and the donkey talks to Balaam. A lot of listeners may be familiar with that story. But it says in Numbers 22, verse 22, and also verse 32, I believe, that the angel of the Lord with a sword, who's come out to kill Balaam if he crosses him, has come out as a Satan against Balaam. And so that's the earliest time we get a heavenly Satan figure. The next time we get a heavenly Satan, it's in Zechariah 3, where you have Zechariah sees a vision of the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord. And here it's the title, it's the Satan, it's the Satan who's involved there. From there, the next place I would go, my next stop would be 1 Chronicles 21. Where it's not the Satan, but a Satan who instigates this census that David gets in trouble for, that Israel gets in trouble for, perhaps I should say. From there, I would move along to Job. Job would be the latest text in the Old. Now, about Job, it's not uncommon for me to hear someone say that Job is one of the earliest books in the Bible. And what I tell students is no, that's not actually the case. The setting of Job is very ancient. The setting of the story of Job is back in the time of the patriarchs, very likely. Most scholars agree about that. But the composition of Job would have been much later. The example I give students is that, 20 years ago or so, there was a movie that came out called 10,000 BC. It's not a movie that I endorse very highly, but it was a movie called 10,000 BC. And I tell students that the movie 10,000 BC was set in 10,000 BC, but it actually was not released until sometime in the 2000s AD. So that Job is kind of the same way. Job is set in the patriarchal era, but it's really a later text, probably exilic, post-exilic by the time it's finished, and even after Chronicles by the time it's completed. So from there, if you're wanting to read now, if you're just reading with a regular Bible, from there you skip to the New Testament. But if you have a copy of some of these other early Jewish works with you, and you can find a lot of these online, from there I would move along to the Book of the Watchers, which is 3rd century BC, the Book of Jubilees, which is 2nd century BC. From there are several Dead Sea Scrolls you could read. I'll throw these names out there. I understand that these may be unfamiliar to a lot of listeners. The Damascus document, the treatise on the two spirits, these would be good Dead Sea Scrolls to read. Then from there, I'd move along to the New Testament. And by the time you get to the New Testament, there's enough going on where, at least in my book, I don't trace a chronological development within the New Testament itself, although that would be fun to try to do. But by that point, you can kind of read the New Testament as is, and I don't think you're going to lose a whole lot by not reading it chronologically.
So, and I don't necessarily mean that like what's your favorite translation, but for example, I'll say the New English translation. Excuse me, the New English translation, they have a ton of footnotes, so that may be, that's a thing that I was thinking that may be helpful as you're reading through the texts, right? Like as Ryan laid them out, as you're reading through those footnotes might help you because they might have some comment on what's happening. But if there is a, I don't know, a study Bible, or for sure commentaries that you would say as you sit down and read these, what amplifying information is there out there that will help people understand these texts better?
Yeah, that's okay. Now I think I understand your question better now. I apologize. Let's see, study Bibles are great. Yeah, of course, study Bibles come in a lot of different brands. There's a study Bible for nearly every kind of Bible reader there is. And so there are evangelical Christian study Bibles, there are mainstream Protestant study Bibles, there are Catholic study Bibles, there are Jewish study Bibles. The SBL study Bible is a really good one, written by some of the leading scholars in the world. Some of the information in it may be a little bit confusing for evangelical Christians because some of the methods that are practiced by scholarly guild are not methods that are familiar to Christians. But even so, there would be a lot of helpful information in a study Bible like that. There is if you're interested in studying the Bible for yourself, one of the main tools I would recommend for you to have for your library would be a good Bible dictionary. If you have enough money to buy a multi-volume Bible dictionary, that's even better. But a Bible dictionary is going to have reference articles on every single book of the Bible, but also in so many of the major ideas, terminology, persons, and theological issues. So a good Bible dictionary would be helpful as well.
Is there one in particular that you would recommend?
This is another one too, where there's probably as many as there are different types of Christians. Let me think. For a multi-volume set, the IVP dictionary series, that's like an 8-volume series where you have a dictionary on the Pentateuch, a dictionary on the historical books, a dictionary on the wisdom literature, a dictionary on the prophets, and then 4 dictionaries correspondingly on different aspects of the New Testament. That's a great one. And it is also very recent. As a matter of fact, I think they've redone Jesus and Paul. So those are very recent, the Jesus and Paul dictionaries. And I suspect they have plans to redo some of the others as well. If you're looking for a single volume Bible dictionary, let's see, there used to be what is called the New Bible Dictionary. I think it was published by IVP, which was good. And it's kind of evangelical in its leanings. Erdman's may have a Bible dictionary, the Erdman's Bible dictionary, the Bible. That I don't think I'm making that up. I think that's a thing, and that would be one that's a little more not as evangelical, a little more middle of the road as far as the information that's in it. That one wouldn't be bad as well. Are you aware of any, Jared? I don't use a lot of one-volume Bible dictionaries myself, but perhaps you're familiar with something.
I think the few that I have are mainly New Testament. One of them's not in here. I got the Paul one, and I mean I'll have it linked in the show notes. But I remember when that dropped because coincidentally it dropped on my birthday like 2 years ago. And then so the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters, IVP released that one, and then I have it's a background commentary, the Craig Keener ones, which are, I mean,
Right.
it's a similar thing, just slightly different. No, and look, I asked that because when I invite people on and they're like, who's your target audience? Honestly, me when I was 15, me sitting in church, maybe not getting the best education on Bible, but trying to really engage with biblical text as much as I could. And so the single volume ones are probably more accessible for people. But then I'm also reminded that like several people on here have thrown out Bible Odyssey that SBL has. There may be articles on these kinds of things that are very helpful. And then you know what? Like it may cost you money, but joining the Society of Biblical Literature gets you access to a huge repository of articles, primarily through the Journal of Biblical Literature. But yeah, there are a lot of online sources, and I don't know because I haven't poked around too much on there. But does Bible Gateway have commentary functions in there? Do you know, or is it just Bible translations? Which is fine. I'm not knocking them if that's what it is.
That's a great question. I've used the free Bible Gateway. I don't know if there's like a subscription level where you get access to some stuff like that or not.
They have ads, so I'm assuming there's a subscription out there, and that may absolutely be the case. Also, Google and Google Scholar particularly may be your friend in this regard if you have questions on that kind of thing.
It's such a strange time. We used to be able to tell students, when you do research, don't look for anything online. But now there's some really good stuff online, but there's also some really bad stuff. I try to give my students some guidance in being able to sort it all out and distinguish the good from the bad. But there really is some good stuff online these days if you can find it. But yeah, Society of Biblical Literature is a great place to go. That's mainstream scholarship. Actually, that's a wide range of. I shouldn't say it's just mainstream scholarship. Society of Biblical Literature includes a lot of folks from approaching the text from a lot of different perspectives. Although the things they publish for the most part is more mainstream scholarship, and again, evangelicals can benefit from that. Although some of it is going to be a little different from what they're accustomed to as well.
Yeah, but they can handle it. I believe in them.
I do too. I'm with you.
So with regard to recommendations, though, and go as big as you want, honestly, but what would you recommend for people, like specific works in addition to your book? Because I really do mean it, guys. Go get this book and read it and learn from it. But what would you recommend that people go check out to learn more about the development of biblical text, or Satan as a figure, or the development of the Satan?
Yeah, man, Jared, one of the reasons that I wrote the book was because there wasn't really anything else that did this the way that I did it or was up to date. There are some really great oldies but goodies. Let's see here if I can. J. Burton Russell has a 4-volume series, one on Satan in the Old Testament, one on Satan in the New Testament and early Christianity, one on Satan in the Middle Ages, and one on Satan more recently. And it's really interesting. And one of the great things about his books is, especially those later ones, is they get into the literature that I do not. I get to the New Testament and I quickly bail out because that's where my competence ends. And some people might argue that's even questionable there. But I certainly can't handle the medieval stuff or the modern stuff. But J. Burton Russell would do that. There's another book that's similar to mine, came out just a couple of years after mine, by Archie Wright. And it's another scholarly book published by Fortress Press, I believe. And so if you read my book and you say, hey, I'd like to read something else that's this level academic, Archie Wright's written a book on Satan as well. There are a number of popular books on Satan, but the problem with the popular books is they tend not to be written by experts in the biblical literature or the Jewish literature or the Christian literature. And so a lot of what they're doing is just recycling and popularizing a lot of the old ideas. And so you're not going to, they're very readable, but I'm not sure that they're going to scratch that itch of really explaining to you what's going on in the biblical literature. Let's see, what else is there? That's all that comes to mind right now. There's a recent, there's a recent book by an author whose name I'm going blank on, a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York. I think the volume may be called God's Monsters. It's kind of a really student friendly.
Is it Esther Hamori?
That's who it is. That's Esther Hamori. Yes. I apologize, Esther, if you're listening. I'm a fan, but I just couldn't remember your name.
Hold on. Do you want to take it again? Do you want to start over and I'll just edit that out? That's fine.
I can do that, or if it's more fun to leave it in, whichever one you want to do.
I'm enjoying myself either way, so it's your call.
Well, we'll just leave it in.
Okay.
But it's I've only read a part of it, but I know a lot of people have enjoyed reading it and have enjoyed her sense of humor. Now she's definitely going to come from a more progressive theological standpoint, but some listeners may find her book helpful.
I mean, I enjoyed it. I listened to it around the time that it came out. I mean, on the monster studies thing, one of my earliest guests was Heather McCumber. She wrote Recovering the Monstrous in Revelation. And that, I don't know if you've read that, but that was a really good book, kind of taking a look at Revelation in a way that I had not. And learning that there was such a thing as monster studies. That was revelatory, not to keep beating that drum. Speaking,
you just jogged my memory, Jared. The last year, I believe 2025, literally last year. There is now or published last year is an Oxford Handbook on Biblical Monsters. And so that would be a pretty handy resource. I wrote the article on Satan in that. Actually, I think there are 2 articles on Satan in it, and I deal with the biblical era, and there's someone else who writes on Satan in the modern era. But then there are articles on other monsters as well. I actually haven't read through it yet myself, but I assume there'll be an article on Leviathan and figures like that, as well as maybe demons. But that might be a really handy resource.
And you know what, Ryan? I knew that you did. And for a moment, because I had already, I reached out and you weren't able initially, early on in the podcast. And when I saw your name on there, when I was scrolling through the table of contents, I was like, ooh, maybe I'll pivot. And I was like, no, I want to talk to him about this book first before I talk to him about anything else. I'm going to stick to my guns on this. I would love to. I want to sit down and read that and see if there's any material. And if you're interested, and if you could say no here now, but I may be reaching out to you once I get back into that particular edition to talk about that article, because I like talking to you. What do you read for fun, though?
What I read? See, this is interesting. My fun reading recently has not been in biblical studies. I've been reading about leadership. I'm teaching a class on leadership right now, and I'm a new administrator myself, so I've been reading a little bit about leadership, and I've been reading about preaching. I'm serving in a church these days, and when I went to seminary, I did a Master of Art in New Testament and another Master of Art in biblical languages, but I didn't do an MDiv, so never took a preaching course. And so I'm reading some books on preaching right now, trying to become a better communicator. Those are the books I'm reading for fun right now, Jared.
Good. I mean, anything in particular?
I just picked I wish I could remember the author. There's a series of books out by Westminster John Knox Press, which is a Presbyterian publisher, good academic, but faith-based publisher as well, and a series of books called like Preaching and I picked up a volume at the recent SBL Society of Biblical Literature meeting called Preaching and the 30-Second Commercial. And the way this series of books works is you have a preaching specialist or a preaching professor partner with someone who's a specialist in something else. And in this case, it's a preaching professor partnering with like an advertising executive or something like that. The question they ask is what can we learn from these people who are specialists in getting people's attention and getting a message across in a short amount of time that we can apply to preaching. And so that's one that I've begun reading. There's another one in that series called like Preaching and I don't know, I can't remember the title, but it's about preaching in movies. And it's about how can you use storytelling techniques that are used in cinema to help you with your sermons. And so that's one that I've just begun reading and I'm really interested, but I don't know enough to tell you about yet.
That's fair. I'll link to that whole series. So you don't, I mean, it's fine because I'm sure there are more. I get like the email updates. So those sound familiar. And I think they push those out pretty regularly. I am curious though. And look, it's absolutely fine. I'll find a way to edit it out if you're like, I don't want to answer that. Do you have your own personal definition of leadership?
Goodness, I do not. My own definition of leadership. Let me think. My mind was not on this topic at all as I was thinking about this podcast.
Sorry.
I mean, it was interesting. I've been thinking about it a lot recently, and so I would love to share some things with you about it, but I don't know that my mind's going to be able to come up with it in the next 5 to 10 seconds.
So, look, that's absolutely. So I asked though, because I remember I knew that I was going to be asked at an interview one time about leadership, and I debated in high school, so trying to come up with a broadly applicable definition for a term so that I don't get bogged down in fighting over what a term means. But in this case, it's like, how can I apply it? Because I felt like the gradient was always people's definitions skew toward good leadership, and that's fine. But then you're assuming that a bad leader is not leading. And if people are following you, you're leading. So this is what I landed on, and I don't know if this is helpful or not. And maybe this is me stroking my own ego, but an action which leads to a similar action. And it incorporates both, right? Someone who's leading poorly will lead to poor followers. Someone who's leading well will lead to good followers. And that helps. And then it also is determinative of like, if you're thinking about your behavior and how you're engaging as a leader or a follower, I think that definition, it's durable enough for me anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard a definition quite like that before. The books I've read, everybody has their, and normally the first chapter of the book, they go through all these different definitions that people have proposed, and then the author of the book proposes their own, and some of this stuff, it's kind of it's just semantic, like there's no real objective definition, and what they're saying is very, very subjective. But yeah, as far as a definition of leadership in general, that's not just skewed toward good leadership, an action that results in a similar action. Leadership, something that produces followership, I guess you could say.
Well, you got to be careful with that, because sometimes you're leading and you don't mean to. Right? If you think of leadership too as positional authority, you can go wrong, because I always look, and I learned this in my mid-20s. I was in a leadership training course, and we had a class leader, and we had me, who was the class clown, and I always thought of myself as a class clown. And they took us out and they were like, you are the guy we put in charge, and you are the guy who's actually in charge. And if you guys don't work together to accomplish what we want, there's going to be trouble. And I was like, wait, I'm a leader? And they were like, yeah, if people are following you, you're a leader. So it may not necessarily be that your actions cause people to lead or cause people to follow you, but people are following you, and you have to, like, there's a weight that you should feel. Like, there should be some gravity behind how you consider your position with regard to other people if they're following you. Yeah, sorry. I know that's not what people tuned in for. I know that's not what you showed up for, but you brought it up, and it's like, I just had to pick that scab because it's a topic I like thinking about. But so, yeah, I will throw those in. And if you shoot me an email later on, if you think of any more like leisure reads that you have, I will add those in. But Ryan Stokes, unless you have anything else for us, I'm going to call this one good.
I enjoyed this a whole lot. Your questions were really, I can tell that you're a good student of the Bible because your questions were really good. And I enjoyed this time a lot. Thanks so much, Jared.
Thank you. Take care.